She walks like the world owes her a favor, but she's polite enough not to mention it. The hem of her bias-cut dress kisses the tops of her shoes as she moves, a deliberate glide never meant to hurry. You can tell she spent time getting the folds right, not from vanity, but because she knows what elegance costs and she's paid in advance. The year is 1934, and grace is not a luxury, it's an obligation. The 1930s were not interested in comfort, empowerment, or voice. They were interested in line, silhouette, weight, and restraint. The woman of the 1930s did not scream. She pressed her lips together and waited for the room to come to its senses. Her body wasn't armored like the 1940s, nor built to seduce like the 1950s. It was wrapped, caressed, skimmed, as though modesty and desire had signed an uneasy truce at the side seams. The cut of the decade was not about hiding or revealing, but sculpting motion. The infamous bias cut, born in the atelier, perfected by women who knew how to walk, took silk and made it liquid. Dresses slithered down backs, clung to hips, swooped across shoulders, not with vulgarity, but with inevitability. A woman in a 1930s evening dress didn't announce her presence. She floated into it, like smoke curling beneath a chandelier. Daywear, on the other hand, was pragmatic only in theory. Skirts slimmed, pleats fell like razor folds, blouses buttoned all the way up, not out of prudery, but precision. Belts cinched waists that hadn't eaten properly in months, but looked the better for it. Jackets had gentle structure, never padded, never firm, just the faintest suggestion of discipline. These were not clothes for lounging, they were clothes for surviving, but attractively. And what did women survive? Everything. The market had crashed, the men had fled, to war, to drink, to self-pity. Women became both the audience and performers of their own lives. Fashion followed suit. Trousers crept in, wide-legged and high-waisted, held up by buttons and nerve. Blouses had collars sharp enough to slice through nonsense. Coats flared at angles that made walking alone seem like an entrance, not a failure. For all its utility, the 1930s never gave up on romance. It simply redefined it. Ruffles were minimal, perfectly placed. A flutter at the wrist, a whisper at the hem. Prints were discreet, florals that didn't shout, polka dots that knew their place. Evening gowns favored backless designs, not out of provocation, but because the back was the last private canvas a woman had. Hair was pinned into waves, and hats, oh the hats, perched like punctuation. Nothing was accidental. Even the illusion of ease had to be calculated and steamed. There was austerity to beauty, as if joy had to be rationed. Glamour didn't glisten, it glowed. Women didn't sparkle like ornaments. They radiated like secrets. You didn't dress to stand out, but to belong to something more enduring, more dignified than chaos. The palette mirrored the mood. Dusky roses, tobacco browns, ink blacks, ivory creams, muted, as if the world was speaking in a lower register. Yet there was confidence too. Women pinned stockings with precision even when they couldn't afford silk. They cut, dyed, mended, faked their way into looking appropriate. They understood that the weight of a skirt, the fall of a sleeve, the curve of a collar, these were tools, not decorations. Tools for navigating a world that offered little softness, so they made their own. The body had changed. Gone was the flapper's boyish frame. The 1930s woman had hips again, but didn't flaunt them. Shoulders sloped like old staircases, elegant and resigned. The neck stretched like a question unanswered. She wasn't built to seduce. She was built to endure, and that required a different beauty, one that held itself in, not out. You could see it in the seams. Dresses weren't made to decorate, but to direct the gaze. Seams curved over the hip, dipped at the waist, slicing the body into something legible. They didn't just hold fabric together, they told the truth. There was an honesty in 1930s clothing, the kind that doesn't explain itself. The sleeves were their own story. Early on, they ballooned, but not hysterically like the 1890s, just enough to balance the weight of the world. Later, they narrowed, cuffed with military precision. A 1930s sleeve knew exactly where to stop, never by mistake. Even the way it gathered was intentional. A puff here, a pleat there, like a shrug in fabric. And the fabrics, they didn't stretch, they didn't forgive. They draped, slid, clung, refusing to apologize. Silk crepe, satin, rayon pretending to be silk, all chosen not for comfort but effect. You couldn't slouch in a 1930s gown. The fabric demanded posture, and so women trained their bodies to obey. And yet, there was no fantasy of perfection. A woman didn't need to be flawless, only intentional. A crooked hem didn't ruin you, but bad posture did. A scuffed shoe was forgivable, but a careless silhouette wasn't. There was no decadence, only discipline masquerading as style. But discipline wasn't dullness. There was play, if you knew where to look. Bias-cut gowns with daring backs, wide-legged trousers with crisp shirts, and confidence usually reserved for men. Belts that made coats swing just right. You walked down sidewalks, through stations, into offices that smelled of ambition and ink. Prints, though sparing, had attitude. Tiny florals that looked demure until you noticed the button placement. Geometrics that shifted in motion. Checks and plaids aligned perfectly, like little miracles. And colors, navy like midnight oil, burgundy like dried blood, champagne like surrender. Not cheerful, but potent. Shoes were sturdy, not slippers. Rounded toes, practical heels, laces tied with finality. They were instruments. For walking, for waiting, for taking stairs with dignity. Stockings were essential, even with runs. A well-placed run was like a well-told lie, shameful only if discovered. Makeup was restraint. The mouth the main event, red, but never vulgar. Brows arched like accusations. Cheeks flushed with economy. Eyes darkened just enough to suggest fatigue or mystery. Hair managed, not styled. Waves set with pins and hope. Updos for wind resistance. Nothing in 1930s fashion was easy. It required awareness, calculation, intuition. A woman didn't just dress. She assembled. Tailored herself into something legible, respectable, desirable, but never excessive. She was an economy of style in an era that demanded frugality. And in that balance between necessity and grace, women of the 1930s carved out quiet defiance, wearing hope as surely as they wore silk.